With West Africa's population and economic growth comes vast opportunities for businesses to trade across the region. Despite this, economic growth rates in most of the countries still lags. The region's farmers and firms produce and trade in highly localized markets and do not achieve the sufficient economies of scale required to attract broad-based investments that could accelerate growth owing to a number of constraints, including inefficient transportation and trade barriers along corridors and at borders, a heavy reliance on informal financing sources, and an insufficient supply of reliable and affordable power, resulting in West African products being uncompetitive in the international marketplace. In light of developed strategies through regional organizations and private sector associations to address constraints to competitiveness and demonstrate West Africa's productive potential for greater regional investment, how have these impacted the region's trade prospects so far, and how best can business benefit from future prospects? Joining me to discuss these and more in detail are Dr. Ted George, Founder and Chief Narrative Officer at Cleos Advisory, and Bolaji Sofoluwe, Managing Director, ETK Consulting, both of whom are trade experts. Thank you for joining me this morning, Dr. Ted and Bolaji. Bolaji, I'd like to begin with you and look at some stats. First of all, how big really is the size of the West African market? What are we talking about in terms of economy and economic activity?
Well, thank you very much for having me, Rolaka, and it's nice to be reunited with Ted as well. A lot of what we're talking about is prospects. And I think that's important for us to note at the very beginning, because there's certain things that need to be put in place for some of these great ideas we have about interregional trade to actually come about and for us to actually experience some of the benefits of interregional trade. But at the moment, the West Africa market is worth 700 billion. And most of that is carried by what we call the ECOWAS 4, and that's Nigeria, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal. Those are the most advanced economies in the region, and those are the regions that are doing the most trade at the moment. So if you're looking for a number, that is the estimated size of the market. And then when you look at percentiles, obviously Nigeria is the largest in terms of the trade, because when it comes down to trade, really, we're talking about people and the exchange of goods and services. And Nigerians are the highest migrants across that region of West Africa. So they're trading with each other in those individual markets as well.
Yeah. Thank you. And I was looking for a number, actually. So thanks for that, 700 billion. Dr. Ted, I have to ask you, what are the current levels of intra-regional trade within the region, notwithstanding the size of the economies of the region? And how does this compare to intra-regional trade within other African sub-regions like COMESA, like the East Africa Community?
Well, it's very difficult to say actually how big interregional trade is. I mean, as you'll remember, we've had this discussion before. Actually, how big is interregional trade? Officially for Africa, it's around 15% of total trade flows. And the whole trade flows of Africa is probably in the region of $1 trillion. But it's hard to say because, prices are so skewed by the high commodity prices. The point to say is that when it comes to intra-regional, certainly if you look at SADC or the EAC, that's much more developed. Official figures suggest between 20 and 25% of flows are intra-regional. And that's because somewhere like SADC has been integrated for more than a century. Whereas if you look to somewhere like West Africa, ECOWAS, probably in the region of 7-8% of flows are intra-regional. And it's understandable because if you take somewhere like Nigeria, the largest economy, the vast majority of exports are crude oil or petroleum products going outside Africa, though some of them do actually go to other African countries. Similarly for Cote d'Ivoire, a lot of the exports are around gas or they're around cocoa and other agricultural products. So the truth is that intra-regional trade isn't nearly developed as much as it should be. But the flip side to say to that is it's probably much bigger than people think it is. And anyone who's been to the border, let's say, between Togo and Ghana can see very clearly the amount of goods flowing over there. There's no paperwork going on. Yeah. There is a huge amount of informal trade. And that really is the lifeblood of the trade in this region.
Yes, indeed, Dr. Ted. I was going to say probably a large part of the trade flows are not captured officially. Now, it's been about 2 years since the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement came into force. Bolaji, how do you think that has actually impacted trade prospects and outlook for the West Africa region?
Well, again, just looking at prospects, some of the formal agreements were signed as far back as 2019. However, we're not really beginning to see the benefits of it just yet because of certain barriers to trade. And I'll probably talk a little bit about that later. But I think what it has done is the removal of these non-tariff trade barriers, which has been the bane of Africa's existence for a very long time. Obviously, the plan is that it will increase by about 80%. And we're hoping that will actually come to fruition as well. And, just most of the countries in and around Africa, again, would require infrastructure links for that to actually happen. So we're really excited about this agreement, but we're hoping that actually all the infrastructure that's needed to facilitate it is put in place to make it happen.
Yeah, and of course, the infrastructure needs to be funded. Well, recently we've had quite a lot of supply chain disruptions at the height of COVID, and recently this year, the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Dr. Ted, do you actually see any sort of hidden opportunities amidst all those global economic and political headwinds that can help boost intra-regional trade within West Africa?
Well, I think definitely in the medium to the long term. I think in the short term, we're seeing the crunch. Everywhere in the world, we're feeling higher prices. And I think to get back to Bolaji's point as well, if we want to boost intra-regional trade, there just isn't the marketing infrastructure there. There's not the roads, the warehousing, the ability for goods to move seamlessly across borders, So I would say in the short term, yes, there's certainly opportunities for any traders who have those kind of goods that everyone wants, whether it's petroleum products, fertilizer, food, who might be able to actually find that there's a lot more, they can make higher profits by selling locally in Africa than exporting. But I think in the medium to long term, this is good news because it just shows how dependent Africa has been on external imports of things like food, palm oil, wheat, rice. And so I think there's a real opportunity here because, if you can see the cost, the prices have gone up, it's now going to be worthwhile to actually produce certain goods and services in Africa and sell them in Africa. Just to give one example, if you think of like tomatoes in Nigeria, the largest tomato producer in Africa by far, at least half of them rot before they make it to market. Lack of warehousing, lack of processing, lack of cross-border value chains. But going forward, you could have the possibility of Nigerian tomatoes ending up in soups or in tins in Niger or in Cameroon or other markets. It's just not possible at the moment. So I think it's definitely a positive incentive for inter-regional trade, but we're not going to see the impacts of that for quite a while. It's going to take a long time to build that infrastructure.
Yes, indeed. It's a long road ahead. And, Bolaji, I know ETK Consulting does advise companies doing business across the region. What are some of your clients saying are the main bottlenecks, which may not be immediately apparent to everyone else?
I think one of the biggest bottlenecks more recently from Africa's largest economy, and I was just listening to the conversation you had earlier, is around foreign exchange. I think that has become a major problem when it comes to sort of trading with particularly Nigeria for a lot of my clients. But I think, sometimes you have to question what do people know that you don't know, because of the kind of influx of new business, new opportunities into the region. I think if you're looking long term, you would realize that actually there's a lot of opportunity. So I think, the World Bank has actually recently said that the inter-regional trade will increase by 7%, and there'll be about 450 billion extra, circulating around Africa. And I think when we're talking to our clients, we say to them, in spite of the bottlenecks, there will be opportunities in the long term. Africa is a long game. This is what we always tell people. Africa is a long game. Whilst you might get short-term benefits, you need to be thinking about the future. And this is these. In spite of all the issues that our clients face, we usually emphasize this point to them.
Thank you so much. Recently, the International Chamber of Commerce recently released a report around sustainable trade transactions. And of course, we're on the heels of COP27, which I believe ended yesterday. What impact is sustainable trade really going to have on the region? And does that mean a move towards greater sustainability within the region? Dr. Ted, I don't know if you'd like to maybe take that question.
Yes, absolutely. I think, look, the whole world is moving towards more sustainable trade, which means, for example, if you're getting products, you know that they're not linked to deforestation or child labor or massive fraud. And so the sustainability standards are growing around the world, and the ICC has developed standards for sustainable trade finance for the world. It's currently under consultation. The concern is these standards are based basically on 5 principles. You take any trade and say, where did it come from? Where's it going? What's the purpose, etc. The trouble is, these standards were designed by Western experts for multinational manufacturers. They just won't work in emerging markets, particularly Africa. And so for this reason, I've co-produced a report with the International Trade and Forfeiting Association looking at the impact on Africa. If you think there are millions of SMEs, they do millions of deals, $10,000, $5,000. There's no way they can meet this kind of data requirement. And we need to push back against it. There needs to be recognition that Africa needs more time to make this transition to sustainable trade. But I think there's a flip side here, which is that if you look at the key African trade things, if you think of things like cocoa, or you think of a lot of the other main products that Africa produces, commodities, they actually all have impacts on ES&G. They impact the environment and society. If we do it properly, they're the perfect tool for positive impacts. And that could, if you like, turn the model on its head. So it's not all bad news, but there is a big change which needs to be underway. And we need to make sure the international community understand that we need time, and Africa needs time to make that transition. Otherwise, there will be no just transition in Africa.
Thank you very much, Dr. George. I have to ask you, though, will businesses view this as putting yet more barriers and high hurdles to jump in an already difficult trade environment? How do you think these frameworks will be received on the ground? Perhaps Bolaji might also want to answer that.
So this is a constant debate, amongst African players, or those who are, creating and shaping policy on the continent. It's always a question of what do we prioritize? And this sustainability discussion is always the first to, receive the most amount of criticism, because again, like Ted rightly said, it's created with, Western markets in mind without looking at the realities on the ground in Africa. So I think, Africa needs to create policies that suit the markets, suit their own markets. A lot of these studies are Western funded, actually, or funded by bodies like the Commonwealth, etc. And so, the consultants tend to be, from Western markets, trying to sort of spending time to understand how things actually work in local reality. And so I think it needs to be left to African scholars, African academics, African, trade practitioners. So those in the export processing institutions, that need to come together and start to think about how they can shape policy that actually suits the reality on the ground.
Thank you very much. Well, it is time now for a short break. And when we return, the discussion around intra-regional trade within West Africa continues with Bolaji Sofoluwe and Ted George. Stay with us. Welcome back to Business Week here on Rise News. I've been chatting with Bolaji Sofoluwe, Managing Director, ETK Consulting, and Ted George, Chief Narrative Officer at Clears Advisory. Great to be speaking with you again, Bolaji and Ted. So I want to ask Ted, what relevance or place does port infrastructure have in helping to facilitate West Africa trade? We've seen quite a lot of port projects come online. Are they actually making a difference to the trade landscape?
Well, absolutely. And I mean, as you know, trade is absolutely critical. The port infrastructure is critical to Africa, as so much of Africa's foreign exchange comes from the export of raw commodities, whether it's crude oil, whether it's soft commodities, whether it's minerals, dug out of the ground. And so, the key port infrastructure it runs, whether it's Dakar, whether it's Abidjan, Lagos, or particularly the big ports of Lomé and Cotonou as well, where huge amounts of goods come in as well and find their way into other parts of ECOWAS. But as anyone knows, I mean, if you live in Lagos, the difficulty of just trying to get out to Tinkat Island or to try and actually get to some of this port infrastructure, it's not just about the port itself, it's about all the roads around it, the warehousing as well. So there has been a large amount of investment in the port infrastructure, but it remains inadequate to what is needed. They expect, they estimate and have for years that Africa needs between $100 and $130 billion a year of port investment. And in fact, it's probably getting just a fraction of that, maybe 10, 15 a year. So they are critical critical, these ports, but I think the main thing to say is that it's really about how they connect to the rest of the infrastructure. Do you have proper roads? Do you have proper warehouses? Do countries have the correct access to them? All of those landlocked countries, are they able to access these ports as well? So, a lot more work needs to be done essentially on that point. They definitely are the critical piece of the puzzle when it comes to the infrastructure of trade.
Indeed, and a very important point there around the connection with the broader infrastructure. Someone needs to finance this, not only in the infrastructure, but someone actually needs to finance the goods that are being traded. Now, Bolaji, I want to ask you what opportunities exist for trade finance. Do we even have an idea how big the trade finance market is? What sort of trends are you seeing?
So this is a really good question. Yesterday, I spent my morning, with officials from the UK export finance team talking about this very issue. The market size is estimated at about 42 billion for Africa, but I think that's a gross underestimation. I mean, going back to Ted's point about informal trade across borders and informal lending that's going on to facilitate trade, from, the way we do it in Africa, from family members, from friends, from loan sharks is essentially as well, but also some of the fintech apps and that has come in to the market recently is also facilitating some of this trade. But I would say that the market has the potential to grow because the infrastructure is being put in place for not just international export finance agencies to penetrate the market, but I think Afri-Exim Bank, for instance, is becoming very bullish and aggressive about making sure that trade finance facilities are improved across the continent, and it's really interesting to see. But 42 billion just seems like a tip of the iceberg for me, and I know that about 25% of that will be from the ECOWAS 4. So Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, and Cote d'Ivoire.
Yeah, and I know that Afri-Exim Bank recently introduced the Pan-African Settlement System. As you know, trading across borders, giving some of the legal and regulatory issues can be quite a task. Now, I wanted to ask you, Bolaji, really looking at if you're a Nigerian business that wants to trade with West African countries, just by virtue of proximity, it makes sense to do so. What sort of commodities or opportunities should you be looking at, and to which markets?
Okay, so again, this is always linked to the markets where you have the most access to. As a Nigerian business, and I'm not going to talk in macroeconomic terms or anything. I'm just talking about the average Nigerian business that's looking to export into these countries. One of the major things that you have to think about is the fact that we have a language barrier with some of the other West African markets. So, for instance, if you're trying to sell to Cote d'Ivoire, would you be able to sell finished goods to Cote d'Ivoire? It will mean a completely different type of packaging that you need to put on your products and services, which increases the cost of production. If you're looking at selling just raw commodities such as rice or soya, which is in high demand across the region, how would you be transporting it? Again, thinking about infrastructure. So, I mean, you've got to think about
quite a whole bucket of issues.
Honestly, the entire value chain, and the entire supply chain needs to be considered.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, Bolaji. I wanted to bring Dr. George on one more question, really, and it's a very important one, is will economic and monetary union become a reality in the region to help improve trade prospects? Perhaps you could comment briefly on that.
Yeah, I think the simple question is to say, look, we've been talking about this for years. When you and I were both in the research team in EcoBank a decade ago, we're saying, when are they going to have monetary union? Any day now. And that was 10 years ago. My view would be just referencing back to when you mentioned Afri-Exim Bank and their PAPS, the Pan-African Payment Settlement Solution. The point is that there are a number of solutions out there which enable African countries with different currencies and central banks to settle between each other without using US dollars. And that's the key thing. So my view would be we don't need to create a new Pan-African currency. We want to get out of dollars, but it's possible with PAPS, for example, to make a payment in Naira to someone who's receiving it in Kwacha. And you can do that instantly, and it can be done at relatively low. So I think that is the key to enabling it. We keep our currencies, but we come up with a Pan-African system for paying in between us, and we avoid the dollars.
Thank you so much. Very fascinating discussion, Bolaji and Dr. Ted George. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.